Good morning, everyone. This is Steven with Natalise and Jess Furman. We're here to talk about company culture. Natalise, you had raised this in a conversation previously. Just curious to how you want to go about company culture.
Yeah, for sure. So, as you know, I started Parallel Health fairly recently. It's been, less than a year. And so as I've started to kind of look at our company and kind of go through sort of a little bit of growth, even at this early stage, I've started to think about, company culture, because I think one of the things or something I've heard is that company culture will exist regardless of whether you're mindful about it or not. So even if you don't think about it, something is going to, a culture is going to manifest. And so you might as well be thoughtful about it than ignore it. And, Steve, you've been, at Kirikubby for a few years now and would love to hear about, how you've thought about company culture and similar, Jess, as a leader at your company, how has that culture how has it developed over time, and how have you perceived it and or sort of made an impact there, if any, if that has been top of mind at all. But maybe Steve, let's start with you.
Yeah, for sure. This is a super relevant topic. Our team members, our employees keep pushing us to define a culture that's conducive to balancing personal life and professional life. And for the longest time, I've always thought about us as just a startup, meaning that the core priorities of the company are to accelerate, grow, and generate lots of revenue. So I've always thought about the inner workings of the company as a means to achieve these things relatively fast. But now that we have, I don't want to say a large group, but a larger group, I think we have to be more cognizant that not everyone is going to be thinking about those variables at all times. So, for example, many of our employees have they're either married or they have children. So it hasn't dawned on me as much until very recently that we have to be more careful about the way that we schedule time, that we schedule work and task, because not everyone is going to perceive those things in the same way. So, for example, I have a son, and I have him 3 to 4 times out of the week, and I have to be very cognizant of my schedule around the day. I'm not taking on too many meetings because he's here and he needs my attention as well. But then also understanding the impact of just being a father and how that plays into the work culture. The short answer to your question, Annalise, is that we don't have it figured out. It's a learning process. And as we move from a seed stage company into a Series A company, I think that's one area where we have to pay more attention to. Besides just growing and building and momentum, we really have to pay more attention to the needs and desires of every single team member in the company. And that's going to lead the way to shaping the culture.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, would you say that there are sort of norms that have developed, or that that are maybe known within the company, whether they're official or unofficial? For example, like, you think about companies like Southwest, and Southwest is known for being really great to their employees, and they sort of have this culture of like happiness. You think about companies like Amazon, where they're very well known for just being really hard masters, and they're really, really successful, but it's, everyone knows that when you work there, you're signing up for a very specific culture, and you got to be okay with that.
Yeah, for sure. I think this speaks to the difference between culture and then mission statement. I think where Southwest has really succeeded is that their mission statement and their culture, they're aligned. Whereas if we think about Amazon, I mean, I actually don't know what their mission statement is, but I do know for a fact that their culture is pretty much like hard driving, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so when I think about our company, we do have a mission statement. Our mission statement is to help schools grow and accelerate, because the success of a school also means the success of children and students. So that's been our driving mission statement since the beginning. But now that you've asked the question, I wonder if somehow we need to reiterate on the mission statement to bring in more of the wants and needs and the requirements of our team members and our employees as well. So I'm gonna think about that hardcore.
Yeah, I feel like this is an interesting question because I think like especially like the fact that we're all at various stages, right, of our teams. Like Steve, you have like gosh, how many? Is it 40 or you have like the level of employees you have like how big is your staff?
A little bit over 30 people.
Okay, so this is a great conversation for us all to have because Natalise, you're in the startup phase. You've also like, you've also been at C levels at other companies where you've had to do team building. I've had to do team building at other levels. Um, yeah, I think it's really interesting to see kind of like how this has been approached in different ways. I know for me, like company culture is a really big thing. And for me, it's like we do a lot at Big Noise, a lot of team building stuff just within our teams to the degree where like since we're a startup, everybody is asked to kind of operate, I would believe, like probably 8 levels above what they've been asked anywhere else, and to wear so many different hats. I know the culture where I am at Big Noise is you really have to be a self-starter. If you require a lot of direction or you only kind of want to be in one lane, it's not the right place for you.
Yeah.
So I feel like that set the tone. When we were hired, they hired top down first, right? So like I was hired to build out my team. Same with the production record label side, same with the publishing side. And the 3 people they picked to do it, like my colleagues in each of our divisions, we are just self-starters that like will get it done, will do, kind of are willing to wear a ton of different hats. And I know that when I've been hiring for my division, like that's a really big deal to me as someone that, wants to learn all aspects of this type of business with the understanding that whatever they want to end up doing and specialize in, that I'm happy to educate them and give them the tools they need to move into that space. But yeah, I think knowing that, like, I know that we've done a lot, like just with our, like, our separate division heads on a smaller level to like make sure that like, we do little events or we do things where we meet for a barbecue or like even with COVID, like how do we with masks maybe show up somewhere and kind of like all stay connected. um, I mean, for me, the culture is really important because we're moving and we're all handling so many things at such different scopes and level that, employee retention is a real problem. And I think a lot of people think that it has to do with money, but, statistically speaking, employee retention is increased if you have people feeling like they're in situations where they're seen, heard, and have room for advancement. So, I'm training people who I want to know that I'm invested in their success as they are, contributing to this company and not just showing up and punching in and punching out. But yeah, I love this question, Annalise. I think it's like, I think the other part too is like, yeah, there's the work that we all do. We want to be successful, but you also want to be around people that are going to inspire you to think bigger, and I've been really lucky with that. Like we just onboarded someone new on my team and, she thinks outside the box. Like I give her things to run with and, that makes my job so much better that, and also just more enjoyable that I have someone else there that's not just punching in, punching out, someone that like looks at all the things we're working on and is like, how do we make this better? And, and I think it's also like as a leader, right? Like what kind of culture do you want to create? Like, we just transferred over and now this is her first day today where she's going to be kind of leading the charge for me in terms of what my old coordinator was doing. And, and I told her, I was like, look, you learned all these systems. We're going to be looking them over on a quarterly basis, and anything you see that we can make better, I want to hear about it. I want us to spend less time on our systems and more time innovating and making sure that like we're really growing this division. So I think it's also like, how do you create a culture where you inspire the people around you to have a sense of ownership and stake in the thing that you're building?
Yeah, I think that's super important. I mean, in terms of empowering people, right? And then being open to, um, thoughts and insights from people you wouldn't expect either, right? Like no matter what level they're at. I think you make a great point. I think the other point that you make is, in some sense, it made me think about hiring. That hiring actually is also factor, a contributing factor to culture, because really it's like the people who you're bringing are also going to be contributing to culture. So in some sense, it's representative.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, hiring. I mean, yeah, that's your entry point, right? Like, you think, you know, like for all of like the different, like I have written tests that we have for people that we've brought on board, like for more of the homeworky things where it's like, all right, cool, like I can get an energy or vibe from you, I can see where you've been, I can hear what you're interested in, but there are so many technical elements to what we do that isn't, you wouldn't think are there with a publishing company and with rights and with licenses and in the music industry, which seems like a lot of fun. So we do have written tests that I've created for like those elements of it, but yeah, at the end of the day, like I know the culture I want to create because I know it's going to work with my team, and I also know it's going to be successful for me in terms of having a team that I lead, because I think that's the other part as well, is like, and this is why it's interesting at various stages, because Steve's company is at a different level with employees, right? Like Natalise, like you can really build this culture from scratch, and you can set it up in a way for your company where people are successful, but they're also going to be successful within the context of your style of leadership, which I know, it's different for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, Steve, like for your style of leadership, like your company is at this, the level that it's at. Like, do you feel like this is something you had in mind earlier on? Do you feel like this is a point, could like maybe a pain point that that you haven't had culture in mind at an earlier stage? Like, where do you feel like having a staff of that size, like you fit in as a leader in terms of like the company culture you've created?
It's an interesting topic. In a previous conversation, Natalise had mentioned that, culture is being built whether you have a hand in it or not. So, in other words, even if you don't take an active role in generating company culture, something is happening behind the scenes, and this culture is going to manifest. To answer your question, Jess, we haven't had as an active role in devising company culture as much as I would like. For the longest time, we've just really focused on the business and the growth and the sales side and the product development side of the company. But I want to give our employees, our team members, all the credit for even raising the issue. Just in the past 6 months, we've had a lot of feedback from our staff with regards to being overloaded, task management. How leadership and management can come in and make some things better. I mean, most recently, we were interviewed by Forbes, and the topic was email burnout and Slack burnout. Our contribution to that article was like, one of our internal policies. So recently, we've had a new mandate in our company that basically says that after hours you can't send an email without having it scheduled for the next business day. I mean, that's one of the things that we put
Oh,
in
wow.
place. Yeah, you can't. Like, that's against company policy. And then also with Slack, there is only one channel for after hours, which is the after hours channel, and we have certain individuals on rotation to answer that channel, so not everybody's getting blasted after work. So those are like two things that we put in place to really address some of our employees' concerns, because as a startup, we really can work 24 hours a day, but I don't think
Hmm.
that's something that we want to do. I mean, we're going to kill our people and burn them out. Um,
Yeah.
we what we really want to do is we want to make this a place that will help our employees advance in their careers. But in addition to that, we want this to be like an environment that's conducive to mental health, physical well-being, and all of that stuff. And I don't think that we can do that without the proper input from our employees. So this idea that there needs to be a constant bilateral communications between employee and leadership on this topic, that's absolutely pertinent. And then we also have to iterate on this stuff too, right? It's not like
Hmm.
you put a policy in place and that's going to be good for like the next 2 to 3 years. To Jess's point,
Right.
a company is an organism. It's growing and it's going to go through growth spurts and growing pains, and we have to be cognizant that we have to get feedback in recurring intervals.
Well, yeah, and I think that's exactly it, right? Is that like, it's not so much you have to create a culture at this point. You already have an ecosystem. So like, there is a culture, right? There's people working in a system. So like, what is that culture? Like, what exists? And then, if it's kind of deviated or it's moving in a direction that you are getting that feedback that, you're losing productivity or people aren't feeling inspired within their roles. Yeah. Like, how do you start to shift that? But I think like this is one of those things where it's like culture exists because you have a group of people, right? You have a group of people working towards a common goal in a company, whether or not it's top of mind, there is a very much a culture, right? And that culture means that maybe people work later because they see other people working later, or they leave early because they see other people leaving early. Like, it's interesting to think of, and to, I think about this a lot now. Like I said, with onboarding, like, I'm so excited. She's amazing. I have like a new coordinator for my team that was an intern we just promoted, and it's been really interesting onboarding somebody during the pandemic, where we're not in the offices, and like, what does that mean for her to be able to like sit next to me and go to meetings and go to events and like also just see the rest of the team interacting, versus these video calls. And that to me is like, how do I instill in her this culture that we have? All the markers are there, but given like these like pandemic limitations, and that's interesting. That's another thing I'd like to hear from you guys too, like Natalise and Steve, like running your teams now remotely. Like, how do you feel like that's impacted your company culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, most of my team, they're in the lab, and I'm not in the lab every day. And so, in some ways, I have to be really thoughtful about the times when I go into the office and or organizing sort of separate, meetings or even lunches, right? To kind of uh, develop and cultivate, meaningful relationships. And so that's something that I've been thinking about recently.
The other thing that I want to say is that it's important for leaders of organizations to take an active role in, and just you had just mentioned this, right? It's not good enough just to say this is the policy, but you also have to follow your own policy, because if you work late and you work and your employees know that, this is these are your habits, they're going to be inclined to think like, well, should I be embodying those habits as well? Do you know what I mean? I just had a recent conversation with one of our team members, and she mentioned that. She was like, yeah, I get it. We're not supposed to be emailing each other after hours or slacking each other. And although I don't get slack after hours, the next day when I come into work, I can see that there have been some Slack communications going on after hours, and it was mostly between the leadership team. And that made me feel like, maybe I should be doing that too if I aspire to be a leader in an organization in the future. So,
Mm,
you know,
that's
it's
interesting.
osmosis, right? So even though, you put down the blueprint as a leader, I think you have to follow that blueprint. Otherwise, your team members are going to look at you and be like, well, you're telling us that this is company policy, but, why are you outside of this? Why are you an exception?
Well, I mean, this is where I might disagree a bit. Like, I mean, I know how I work best. And I know that that's not the way that everybody else works best. And this is where I feel like, yeah, you can have policies, but it's also communication. So like, I'm very clear with my team. Like, I, I will work when it makes sense to work. If we have something that comes in that's on European hours, it might be up early, or late. Like, if I need someone to do something outside of the range within which their hours are, say like roughly 10 to 6, right? If I need something that's an emergency, I will communicate very clearly that I need help. Other than that, they're free to just disregard and just work during their hours. Because for me, and we talked about this kind of off thread before we got to this podcast, Steve, but like, I am in a ton of meetings during the day. So sometimes I need to catch up late at night or early in the morning because my actual work time during the day is being taken up by meetings and calls. And I don't get to really dig in a quiet way on some contracts or some correspondences that require a little more thoughtful, quiet time for me to handle the right way, as opposed to when emails and texts and things are flying. So, I think that like, I don't know. I feel like everybody has a different style, and my style of leadership is like, get the work done and communicate effectively, and don't do what I do. It works for me. It might not work for someone else. I'm results driven. I want to see the results, but I also feel like, we're all going to have different styles of how we work. Um,
Yeah.
and, I think that like part of what you're talking about is that culture thing, Steve, which is like how much of that culture reinforces the fact. So if that person's telling you that they feel stressed because they see Slack happening overnight, like that's a different thing. That's a peer. There's like that's peer versus say like leadership. I think in that level, like what is their expectation with their peers that they're going to gain favor if they're doing something contrary to what works for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, right? Like when we think about companies and schedules, it's like it could also be that your company's seasonal, right? So maybe at some point, like for our company right now, we're running an IRB approved study. We're sequencing. We're doing a lot in the lab. So my co-founder's in the lab like till really late at night, and it's just something that he's going to have to do for the next 3 months because that's what we're doing, and we got to get it done. And then maybe hopefully there'll be a break after that. And so I think there's part of that where you just get it done, but like taking it a step broader, or taking a step back, I think at the end of the day it's also about trust, right? Like you just trust everyone to get their work done the way that they're gonna get it done. So whether you're on Slack at 9 p.m. or 9 a.m. or 3 a.m., I mean, 9 to 5 is just a construct, right?
It is. It is. Um, that being said, I also think there should be some consideration brought to, gosh, can I say this? Like geographical differences in culture as well. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, like, the way that we work in the US isn't necessarily the same, or the value in the way that we work in the US could be different than, say, folks in Singapore, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
folks in Denmark, for example. So, and I'll even go one step further to say that there are even, intercontinental differences from state to state in the US, or from pockets of, like Bay Area, Silicon Valley culture is different than like culture up north in Mendocino County, with regards to, how people perceive their work day, right? I can say like for folks in the Silicon Valley, and I'm going to generalize a little bit here, it is the mentality of like get it done by any means necessary. It's mostly the people that grind the hardest will get the fruits of their labor, whereas folks that are working, say, like in a less demanding sort of industry might not see it that way. When we're thinking about a workforce that's distributed, consideration needs to be highlighted a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I mean, 100%. You're right. Like people like in places in Europe where they take like I've been on projects where I'll get a bounce back and they're like, I'm on my yearly holiday and be back in 2 months. And it like
Right.
blows my mind a bit because
Exactly.
it's just like not the culture that we have here. Which is why I think, look, we're all in startups. I think this is why this is such an interesting conversation is that, there are certain, gosh, look at even like, certain elements of the entertainment industry or other places where there's like a workforce that has a union. These aren't even conversations in terms of like when you work that's debatable.
Right.
Like if there's a union, it's very well laid out, right? Like what overtime is, what this is, what I think like yeah, we are having this conversation in the context of the startup mentality, which is I think a culture in its own right, which is essentially like here are the rules of the game. The way I run my team is going to be differently the way Natalise runs her team, the way you run your team, and I think that is part of the exciting thing with a startup and being entrepreneurial is like you are crafting your culture by setting some of these rules of engagement, right? Um, by saying I want you to be available anytime that I text or call or blah, 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 versus like, these are your hours, like this is a boundary after this time. Don't worry about it. I think that we are able to kind of set these rules with the workforce. And yeah, I agree. You have to be mindful of different areas around the world, but I also think part of having the flexibility to work with companies like ours, like means that like, that's the trade-off, right? Like it's a little bit non-traditional. Um, it's a little bit non-traditional in the sense where you can kind of like craft it. I don't know. I feel like there's a give and take on it. Like I love that I'm in entertainment and that I have to be flexible. There's all different time zones, or all different projects. Like, I'm not someone that works really well when you say to me, within this time range is when we want your brain to work, because it's not going to be the best well suited for international projects, or just projects in general that fall outside the lines, or deadlines that are overnight because they're entertainment related and they're on a tight deadline. So I think that's a bit of a trade-off. I think is if you were deciding to be part of a company, like, this in this lane, there are less protections, or there is like less of a standard, and maybe then and that's the culture too, right? Like, maybe then this isn't, as an employee or someone that wants to get into these types of fields, if you want something really stable where you punch in and punch out, and it's very clearly defined with like massive HR and like and like overtime, like that's part of the culture that you want to be part of. This might not be it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Natalise, your involvement in Parallel Health, how much of your time is spent percentage wise thinking about culture? Because you guys are relatively early and you guys are, getting things off the ground.
Well, I mean, I'd say on it, most days it's like 0% on culture. But I will say that, my co-founder and I, before we even started the company, we actually talked about culture. We said, hey, if we join forces on this, how do you envision the company? How do you envision culture? How do you envision, who are the right sort of investors that you would want to bring on? And what is the working relationship that you would want between us? And that was a very much a two-way street in terms of the conversation that we both, wanted. And so I think we did sort of the groundwork there, because but on the day to day, like, we're just grinding, right? And I think now, after a few months, and building this company, on the business side, now that we're onboarding new people and, we're sort of developing a team, we're like, okay, I'm starting to think a little bit about, okay, how do I want meetings to go? How do I want the cadence to go? How do I want, people to think about their work-life balance? Because it is about retaining people as well. You want great people, but also you look at the people you hire, and if you're hiring right, then they're going to be working hard anyway, right? And you're not going to have to micromanage them. But that means that there is going to be that chance of burnout. So how do you reduce that?
Well, that's a lovely way to wrap up this morning's topic. For our listeners out there, if you guys are involved in startups, companies, company building, we'd love to hear some feedback. On the behalf of Natalise, Jess, myself, wishing you guys a beautiful morning, and look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode of The Unlikely Journey. Peace.